Everyone knows how World War I started. A young Bosnian Serb nationalist named Gavrilo Princip stepped onto a Sarajevo street on June 28, 1914, and fired 2 shots. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, slumped dead in an open car. His wife Sophie died beside him, and within 6 weeks, the most powerful nations on earth were mobilizing millions of men toward the slaughterhouse of the Western Front. That's the story we were taught. An assassination, a cascade of alliances, a tragedy that spiraled out of control because the diplomats moved too slowly and the generals moved too fast. It's a compelling story. It has drama. It has a clear villain, or at least a clear trigger. It has the satisfying shape of a Greek tragedy, one act of violence setting the whole world on fire. There's just one problem. It's not really the story of why World War I happened. It's the story of how it started, and those are two completely different things. Because here is what the textbooks consistently leave out. By June 1914, the major European powers had been preparing for a large-scale continental war for nearly a decade. Not fearing it, not dreading it, preparing for it, planning for it. In some influential circles, actively anticipating it. The military timetables were drafted, the mobilization orders were pre-written. The loan structures were already in place. When Princip pulled the trigger in Sarajevo, he didn't ignite a peaceful Europe. He lit a fuse that had been carefully laid by bankers, generals, diplomats, and industrialists over the preceding 20 years. Follow the money, and the real story looks completely different. Let's start with what everyone agrees on, and then show you what that picture is missing. The conventional narrative of World War I rests on 3 pillars. First, the alliance system. Europe was divided into 2 armed camps, the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy on one side, and the Triple Entente of France, Russia, and Britain on the other. Second, militarism. The major powers had spent decades building ever larger armies and navies, creating a kind of arms race logic that made conflict feel inevitable. Third, nationalism. Explosive forces of ethnic identity, imperial competition, and wounded pride had been building pressure across the continent for a generation. Taken together, these 3 pillars explain why Europe was a tinderbox in 1914. What they don't explain is why the tinderbox was built in the first place, or who benefited from the fire. And here is where conventional history starts to fail us. Because if you look beneath the surface of the alliance systems, beneath the military build-ups and the nationalist rhetoric, you find something the standard narrative almost never puts front and center: an extraordinary web of financial pressures, industrial interests, and institutional incentives that made war not just possible, but in certain very specific ways, useful, to a very specific group of people. Consider what Europe looked like financially in the decade before 1914. Germany had emerged from the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871 as a unified, rapidly industrializing powerhouse. Between 1870 and 1913, German industrial output roughly quadrupled. German steel production, which had been negligible in 1870, had surpassed Britain's by 1914. German banks, Deutsche Bank, Dresdner Bank, Commerzbank, had become major players in international finance, funding railways and infrastructure projects from Baghdad to Buenos Aires. Britain, the world's dominant financial and industrial power for most of the 19th century, was watching this with undisguised anxiety. British exports were losing ground to German competitors in markets Britain had once considered its own. British shipbuilders were struggling to maintain their lead as German yards expanded rapidly. The City of London remained the world's preeminent financial centre, but that supremacy was no longer unquestioned. France, meanwhile, was sitting on something remarkable: an enormous pool of domestic savings that French banks had channeled into foreign loans on a massive scale. By 1914, France was the world's second-largest foreign creditor after Britain. French investors had poured enormous sums into Russian railways, Serbian infrastructure, Romanian bonds, and Turkish debt. The total value of France's foreign investments has been estimated by historians at somewhere between 40 and 45 billion francs, a figure equivalent to roughly 2 years of France's entire pre-war GDP. Here is why that matters. A very significant portion of those French loans had gone to France's key ally, Russia. and Russia had used much of that money to build exactly what France's military planners wanted it to build: railways. Specifically, railways in Western Russia pointed toward the German border. The strategic logic was explicit. France wanted Russia to be able to mobilize its enormous army quickly enough to threaten Germany from the east if Germany ever moved against France in the west. French loans were, in a very literal financial sense, subsidizing a military strategy. Germany saw this clearly, and Germany's response reveals something that the textbooks tend to understate. Germany was not simply responding defensively to French and British power. Germany had its own aggressive economic ambitions that were bringing it into direct conflict with established imperial interests. German industrialists and bankers had been pushing for decades for a sphere of economic influence in the Middle East, most visibly in the form of the Baghdad Railway project, a proposed line that would connect Constantinople to the Persian Gulf and potentially give Germany access to the oil resources that were just beginning to attract serious strategic attention. British strategists were alarmed. The Baghdad Railway, if completed, would run through territory that Britain considered within its sphere of influence. It threatened the overland route to India. It complicated British naval dominance in the Persian Gulf. And then there was the German Navy. Beginning in 1898, under the direction of Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, Germany launched a dramatic naval expansion program. Between 1898 and 1914, the German High Seas Fleet grew from a coastal defense force into the second-largest battle fleet in the world. By 1914, Germany had built or was building over 40 capital warships. Britain's response was not diplomatic. It was financial. The British government, under significant pressure from First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill and others, committed to maintaining a ratio of 16 British dreadnoughts for every 10 German ones, what became known as the 16-to-10 standard. This was an enormously expensive commitment. Between 1906 and 1914, Britain's naval expenditure roughly doubled. The arms race between the two nations had become, at its core, a competition about who could sustain the greater financial burden for the longest period. And here is the point that most history books treat as background noise, but which is, in fact, absolutely central to understanding why war came when it did. By 1914, several of the major European powers were approaching the limits of what their financial systems could comfortably sustain in peacetime military spending. The arms race was creating genuine fiscal strain. For some governments, particularly in Austria-Hungary and Russia, the pressure was becoming acute. There is a concept in political science called the Preventive War Logic. The idea is that a state that believes it is losing power relative to a rival may calculate that it is better to fight now, when it still has a chance, than to wait until the power gap has grown wider. Historians debate how consciously this logic was applied in 1914, but the evidence, particularly from the German side, suggests it was very much present in the thinking of key decision-makers. Germany's chief of the General Staff, Helmuth von Moltke the Younger, made this case repeatedly in the years before 1914. Russia was industrializing rapidly. Russian railways, financed largely by French loans, were expanding. Within 5 to 7 years, Moltke and his colleagues calculated Russia would be strong enough to withstand a German offensive. After that point, Germany's strategic position would deteriorate steadily. The window for a war Germany could win was closing. Moltke was not alone in this assessment. Austro-Hungarian military planners had their own version of the same anxiety focused on Serbia and the South Slav nationalist movement that threatened to pull their multi-ethnic empire apart. For Austria-Hungary, the Sarajevo assassination was not a tragedy that forced war. It was, in the words that shocked many when a senior Austrian official used them, a gift, a pretext, an opportunity to settle what Vienna saw as the Serbian problem before that problem got any worse. And in Berlin, key figures within the military and foreign policy establishment, the so-called War Party around Moltke, the Prussian military leadership and certain industrialists, were receptive to Austria-Hungary's framing, not because they were reckless, but because their own analysis told them that time was not on Germany's side. None of this means Gavrilo Princip was irrelevant. He was the match. But the room was already full of gas. The deeper truth about World War I, the truth that the assassination narrative conveniently obscures, is that by 1914, the major European powers had created a system so loaded with financial pressures, military timetables, and strategic anxieties that it required only a single incident of sufficient emotional weight to set it in motion. And when we ask who was responsible for creating that system, the answer is not a lone gunman in Sarajevo. It is decades of decisions made by governments, military establishments, and financial institutions that built an interlocking structure of debts, alliances, arms spending, and imperial competition that made a major war not just possible, but, for certain actors, at certain moments, strategically preferable to the alternative. That is the real origin of World War I. Not a bullet on a Sarajevo street, but a financial and strategic architecture that made the bullet's consequences unavoidable. Let's talk about money. Not in the abstract, not in the vague sense of economic tensions that historians mention in passing before moving on to the diplomacy. Let's talk about specific institutions, specific numbers, and specific people who had a direct financial stake in what happened in the summer of 1914. Because when you look at the balance sheets of pre-war Europe, something uncomfortable becomes very clear. A great war was not just politically conceivable. For certain financial actors, in certain very specific ways, it was economically logical. Start with Britain. By 1914, the City of London was the undisputed centre of global finance. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. London's merchant banks, Barings, Rothschilds, Schroders, Hambros, sat at the centre of an international lending web that stretched from Buenos Aires to Bombay. When governments needed to raise money, when railways needed to be financed, when colonial infrastructure needed to be built, they came to London, and London had done extraordinarily well from this arrangement. Britain's total foreign investments by 1914 have been estimated by economic historians at somewhere between £3 and £4 billion, a staggering sum for the era, equivalent to perhaps 40 to 50% of Britain's entire national wealth. The annual income from these investments was running at roughly £200 million per year. To put that in context, that income stream alone was larger than the entire military budgets of several medium-sized European powers. But here is the tension inside that prosperity. A very substantial portion of Britain's foreign investment was concentrated in exactly the regions where German economic ambition was most aggressively expanding: Latin America, the Ottoman Empire, Southern Africa, Persia. In market after market, British financial interests were encountering German competition. Not just commercial competition, but the competition of German banks offering financing terms that British institutions were struggling to match. Deutsche Bank in particular had become a formidable rival. Its role in financing the Baghdad railway project was only the most visible example of a broader pattern. German banking capital moving into territories and sectors that British capital had previously dominated. For the City of London, a Europe in which German industrial and financial power continued to grow at its pre-war trajectory, was a Europe in which Britain's financial supremacy would face mounting pressure. That doesn't mean London's bankers wanted war. Many of them actively feared it. But it means the competitive context mattered enormously to how British elites perceived the German challenge. Now look at France, and look carefully. France's foreign lending was extraordinarily large relative to the size of the French economy. But what's crucial to understand is the structure of that lending, specifically where the money went and what it was buying. The single largest recipient of French foreign capital in the decades before 1914 was Russia. Between 1887 and 1914, French investors purchased approximately 12 billion francs worth of Russian government bonds. The French banking sector, led by institutions like Crédit Lyonnais, the Banque de Paris et des Pays-Bas, and the Société Générale, organized and distributed these bond issues to hundreds of thousands of small French savers who were encouraged by the French government and the French press to view Russian bonds as a safe and patriotic investment. By 1914, historians estimate that somewhere between 1.6 and 2 million French households held Russian securities. These were not wealthy speculators. They were teachers, shopkeepers, civil servants, farmers. The French middle class, their savings tied directly to the financial health of the Russian imperial government. The French government was deeply aware of this, and it shaped French foreign policy in ways that rarely get discussed openly. Because here is the mechanism. French loans to Russia were not purely commercial transactions. They were explicitly conditional, in many instances, on Russia using the borrowed capital in ways that served French strategic interests. French diplomats and military attachés negotiated directly with Russian counterparts over how the money would be spent. The French military wanted Russia to build railways in Western Russia. The French got their railways. French banks wanted Russian bond issues to be distributed through Paris. The French got their distribution fees. French industrialists wanted export contracts linked to the loan agreements. They got those too. The French foreign lending program was, in significant part, a financially disguised military alliance. And by 1914, France had an enormous financial incentive to keep Russia strong, solvent, and militarily capable. Because if Russia collapsed, if the Russian government defaulted on its bonds, if the Tsarist regime destabilized, the savings of 2 million French households would be devastated. That is not a background fact. That is a core driver of French foreign policy in the crisis of July 1914. Germany's financial situation tells a different story, and in some ways a more revealing one. Germany was, by 1914, a major industrial and commercial power. But Germany was also, relative to Britain and France, a capital-scarce country. German banks were large and sophisticated. But Germany's domestic savings pool, while growing, was smaller than Britain's or France's relative to the economy's investment needs. Germany was a net capital importer for much of the late 19th century, only recently transitioning toward becoming a net exporter. This created a specific kind of financial pressure that shaped German strategic thinking. Germany needed access to international capital markets, and the dominant international capital market was London. German government bonds, German corporate securities, German trade finance, all of this was deeply intertwined with the City of London. German banks maintained major operations in London. London discount houses financed much of Germany's international trade. The two economies were, at the financial level, deeply interdependent. Here is the paradox that historians don't emphasize enough. The two countries most likely to go to war with each other, Britain and Germany, were also the two economies most deeply intertwined with each other financially. In 1913, Britain was Germany's largest export market, and Germany was Britain's second-largest trading partner. Bilateral trade between the two countries was running at roughly 1.4 billion marks per year. British banks had significant exposure to German borrowers. German banks had significant London operations. Norman Angell, the British journalist and future Nobel Peace Prize laureate, made this argument explicitly in his 1910 book, The Great Illusion. War between the major European powers, Angell argued, would be economically catastrophic for all parties. The financial and commercial interdependence of modern industrial nations made conquest economically pointless. The book sold enormously well. It was widely discussed in elite circles across Europe. And it was completely correct in its analysis. And it did not prevent the war. Which tells you something important. The decision to go to war in 1914 was not made by people doing careful cost-benefit analysis of long-term economic consequences. It was made by people responding to short-term political pressures, military timetables, and strategic anxieties that overwhelmed the longer-term financial logic of interdependence. But let's look more closely at who, financially, was positioned to benefit, or at least to survive, from a major war. The arms manufacturers are the obvious place to start, and they deserve more attention than they typically receive. Krupp, the German steel and armaments giant, had by 1914 become one of the largest industrial enterprises in the world. The Krupp works at Essen employed over 80,000 workers. Krupp supplied artillery, naval guns, armor plate, and a vast range of military hardware to the German military and to foreign customers on every continent. Between 1887 and 1912, Krupp's annual sales had grown from roughly 40 million marks to over 300 million marks, an increase of more than 700%. Military contracts were the core of that growth. The Krupp family's relationship with the German imperial establishment was intimate and deliberately cultivated. Kaiser Wilhelm II visited the Krupp works regularly. Alfred Krupp's successors maintained close personal relationships with the German military leadership. This was not corruption in a simple sense. It was a structural fusion of industrial interest and military planning that made German rearmament and crop profitability two sides of the same coin. Britain had its equivalent. Vickers and Armstrong Whitworth, the two dominant British armaments manufacturers, were supplying warships, artillery and munitions to the Royal Navy and to foreign governments simultaneously. Armstrongs had built warships for Japan, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Turkey and Spain, among others. The arms trade was genuinely international and genuinely lucrative. Vickers' profits in the years immediately before 1914 were running at levels that would have been unimaginable a decade earlier. France had Schneider-Creusot, which occupied a similarly central position in the French military-industrial complex, and which had its own extensive network of foreign contracts and political connections. These were not fringe actors. These were central institutions of their respective national economies, with direct access to military and political decision-makers, with substantial financial interests in continued high levels of military spending, and with structural incentives that pointed toward, not away from, armed conflict. There is one more financial dimension to the pre-war picture that almost never appears in standard histories, and it is perhaps the most striking of all. In the decade before 1914, European governments were borrowing heavily to finance their military build-ups, and those borrowings were creating a set of institutional relationships that had very specific consequences for how the crisis of 1914 played out. Consider Austria-Hungary. The Habsburg Empire was, by 1914, in a state of chronic fiscal stress. The empire's finances were complicated by its dual structure. Austria and Hungary maintained separate budgets and separate finance ministries, with joint expenditure on defense and foreign affairs negotiated between them. Military spending had been rising steadily, putting pressure on both halves of the empire's already strained public finances. The Austro-Hungarian government financed much of its deficit spending through bonds purchased heavily by Austrian and Hungarian banks, and to a lesser extent by foreign investors. The empire's largest bank, the Creditanstalt, was deeply enmeshed with imperial finances. So were several of Vienna's other major financial institutions. For these institutions, the status quo, a declining empire hemorrhaging prestige and strategic territory to Serbian-backed South Slav nationalism, was genuinely threatening. A successful military action against Serbia, one that reasserted Austro-Hungarian power in the Balkans and stemmed the nationalist tide, would have stabilized the empire politically and, by extension, financially. This doesn't mean that Viennese bankers were secretly conspiring to start a world war. But it does mean that the financial establishment in Vienna had structural reasons to view military action as preferable to continued imperial decline. When Austrian policymakers debated how to respond to the Sarajevo assassination, they were making their calculations inside an institutional environment that was, at the margin, tilted toward action. And then there is the role of the international bond market itself. In the weeks of the July crisis, as diplomats exchanged ultimatums and military planners activated their mobilization schedules, the financial markets were sending clear signals. Stock prices fell sharply across European exchanges. The Vienna Stock Exchange suspended trading on July 27th, a full 4 days before the major declarations of war. Budapest, Brussels, and several other exchanges followed. The Berlin Bourse was in severe distress. London's discount market effectively froze, as credit became nearly unavailable. The bond markets told the same story. The prices of government securities fell sharply as investors priced in the possibility of war. Holders of French, Russian, German, and Austro-Hungarian bonds were watching their portfolios deteriorate in real time. This matters because it shows something important. The financial establishment, broadly speaking, did not want the war in July 1914. The immediate, measurable reaction of the markets was alarm and liquidation. The City of London was, in the immediate term, terrified. But, and this is the crucial distinction, the financial establishment's fear of war in July 1914 was not enough to stop it. Because by that point, the decision was no longer being made by bankers. It was being made by generals working from timetables that had been fixed months or years in advance, by politicians responding to domestic nationalist pressures they could not control, and by military establishments that had been told, repeatedly, that the window for favorable action was closing. The money had helped build the machine. But by the summer of 1914, the machine was running on its own logic. History loves the image of stumbling. The standard account of how World War I actually began in those final weeks of July 1914 is essentially a story of intelligent men making catastrophic mistakes under pressure. Diplomats who miscalculated, generals who couldn't stop their own mobilization timetables once started, politicians who believed the war would be short and found themselves trapped in something they couldn't end. Sleepwalkers, as the historian Christopher Clark famously called them, men who walked into catastrophe with their eyes half open. It's a generous interpretation, because when you look at the specific decisions made by specific people in specific rooms during the 5 weeks between Sarajevo and the declarations of war, the sleepwalker narrative starts to strain. Some of these men were not stumbling. Some of them knew exactly what they were doing. Let's start in Vienna, because that is where the first and most consequential decisions were made. On June 28, 1914, Franz Ferdinand and his wife were killed in Sarajevo. Within hours, the key question inside the Austro-Hungarian government was not whether this was a tragedy. It was whether it was an opportunity. The man most responsible for answering that question was Count Leopold von Berchtold, the Austro-Hungarian foreign minister. Berchtold was not by temperament a warmonger. He was an aristocratic diplomat of the old school, cautious by instinct, more comfortable in the salons of Vienna than in crisis management. But Berchtold was surrounded by men who were considerably less cautious. Chief among them was Franz Conrad von Hötzendorf, the chief of the Austro-Hungarian General Staff. Conrad had been advocating for a preventive war against Serbia for years, literally years. In the period between 1906 and 1914, Conrad had formally proposed military action against Serbia no fewer than 25 times. He had been repeatedly overruled. Now, with Sarajevo providing a pretext that could not easily be dismissed, Conrad pushed hard for immediate military action. But Vienna faced a problem. Austria-Hungary could not move against Serbia without knowing whether Germany would support it. And Germany's support was not guaranteed. The Austro-Hungarian leadership needed to know whether Berlin would back Vienna if Russia intervened to protect Serbia, as Russia almost certainly would. So on July 5, 1914, barely a week after the assassination, Austro-Hungarian ambassador Alexander Hoyos traveled to Berlin carrying a personal letter from Emperor Franz Joseph to Kaiser Wilhelm II and a memorandum outlining Vienna's intentions toward Serbia. What happened next is one of the most consequential and least discussed moments in modern history. Kaiser Wilhelm II and his chancellor, Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, met with the Austrian representatives on July 5th and 6th, and they gave Austria-Hungary what historians have since called the blank check. Germany, they indicated, would support Austria-Hungary whatever course of action Vienna chose to take against Serbia, even if that action led to a wider European war involving Russia. Read that again slowly. Germany's leadership, aware that a hard Austro-Hungarian ultimatum to Serbia would almost certainly bring Russia into the conflict, which would almost certainly activate France's alliance obligations, which would almost certainly bring Germany itself into war with France and Russia simultaneously, gave Austria-Hungary unconditional backing. This was not a decision made in panic. It was not a decision made by men who didn't understand the implications. The German leadership in July 1914 was not staffed by fools. Bethmann-Hollweg was a sophisticated political operator. The German Foreign Office was staffed by experienced diplomats who understood the alliance system perfectly well. The blank check was a deliberate decision. The question historians have argued about ever since is why. The most illuminating evidence comes from Bethmann-Hollweg himself. In private communications during the July crisis, the German Chancellor articulated something that cut straight through the sleepwalker narrative. In a conversation with his aide Kurt Riesler on the night of July 7th, recorded in Riesler's diary, which historians have analyzed extensively, Bethmann-Hollweg laid out his thinking with unsettling clarity. If war came, he reasoned, and Germany fought well, Germany would achieve a dominant position in Europe. If war did not come, if Austria-Hungary backed down again, as it had during previous Balkan crises, Germany's position would weaken. The Triple Entente would grow stronger, and within a few years, Germany would face a Russia so militarily formidable that the strategic situation would be irretrievable. In other words, Bethmann Hollweg was consciously accepting the risk of a general European war because he calculated that the alternative, continued decline in Germany's relative power, was worse. This is not a man who stumbled into war. This is a man who chose it, with open eyes, as the least bad option available to him given his strategic assessment. Moltke, the chief of the General Staff, was even more explicit. In communications during the July crisis, Moltke made clear that from a purely military standpoint, sooner was better than later. Russia's military reforms, financed by French loans, were proceeding rapidly. Germany's window for a successful two-front war, knock out France quickly in the west, then turn east against Russia, was not going to stay open indefinitely. The Schlieffen Plan, Germany's master strategy for a two-front war, required speed above all else. And speed required that Germany move before Russia's railway network was complete enough to allow rapid Western mobilization. The military calendar was telling Germany, if not now, then when? And the honest answer from a German military planning perspective was, it might never be better than now. Now let's turn to the other side of the equation, because the German decision only explains half of the July crisis. The other half requires us to look at Russia, and at a set of decisions made in St. Petersburg that have received far less scrutiny than they deserve. Russia's key figure in the July crisis was not Tsar Nicholas II, who was personally irresolute and frequently manipulated by stronger personalities around him. The key figure was Sergei Sazonov, the Russian foreign minister, and alongside him the Russian military leadership, particularly General Nikolai Yanushkevich, the chief of the Russian General Staff. When Austria-Hungary issued its ultimatum to Serbia on July 23, a deliberately harsh document designed to be unacceptable, containing 10 demands including the right of Austro-Hungarian officials to participate in Serbia's internal judicial investigations, Sazonov's reaction was immediate and visceral. He reportedly declared, upon reading it, that this meant a European war. But here is what the standard narrative tends to soft-pedal. Russia's decision to mobilize was not a purely reactive response to Austro-Hungarian aggression. It was shaped by its own set of strategic calculations and domestic pressures. Russia had backed down during two previous Balkan crises, in 1908, when Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina, and in 1912 to 1913, during the Balkan Wars. Each time Russia had retreated without forcing a confrontation, it had suffered what its foreign policy establishment viewed as a humiliation. Pan-Slav sentiment inside Russia, the idea that Russia had a special obligation to protect Slavic peoples in the Balkans, was a genuine political force that the Tsarist government could not simply ignore. Sazonov and the Russian military concluded that Russia could not back down a third time without devastating consequences for Russian prestige and, by extension, for the stability of the Tsarist regime itself. On July 25, 2 days before Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, Russia began what it called preparatory measures for mobilization, steps that fell just short of official general mobilization, but that were, in practical military terms, the beginning of the mobilization process. This is a fact that many popular histories of the war's origins treat as a footnote. It should not be a footnote, because those Russian preparatory measures were exactly the kind of signal that German military planners had been watching for, the signal that would activate the logic of the Schlieffen Plan and make German mobilization feel, from Berlin's perspective, not just justified, but urgently necessary. The mobilization timetables of the major powers were interlocking in a specific way. Once any major power began mobilizing in earnest, the others faced intense pressure to mobilize immediately, because the military plans assumed that the side that mobilized fastest would have a decisive advantage. Waiting meant falling behind. Falling behind meant losing. This is the mechanism, the specific, technical, military bureaucratic mechanism, that turned a diplomatic crisis into a world war in the space of 30 days. But there were moments when the machinery could have been stopped, and this is where the hidden players become most important. On July 29th, Kaiser Wilhelm II received a telegram from Tsar Nicholas II, the first of what became a famous series of Willy-Nicky telegrams between the two cousins. Nicholas was appealing directly to Wilhelm, over the heads of their respective governments, asking Germany not to allow the crisis to escalate. Wilhelm's initial reaction was to try to slow the Austrian advance. He sent a telegram to Vienna urging Austria-Hungary to halt its military operations and negotiate, what became known as the Halt in Belgrade proposal. He appeared briefly to be genuinely seeking a way out. What happened next reveals the real locus of decision-making power in Imperial Germany. Moltke, acting without clear authorization from the Kaiser or the Chancellor, sent his own communication to Conrad in Vienna, essentially countermanding the Kaiser's diplomatic signal. Moltke told the Austro-Hungarian military leadership to proceed with full mobilization and that Germany would fulfill its alliance obligations. This was a general unilaterally shaping foreign policy at the most critical possible moment. When Bethmann Hollweg discovered what Moltke had done, he was furious. But he did not reverse it. The diplomatic window, such as it was, closed. Britain's entry into the war has its own cast of hidden players and its own set of decisions that the conventional narrative tends to obscure. The British cabinet in late July 1914 was deeply divided. A significant faction, including the Chancellor of the Exchequer, David Lloyd George, and several other ministers, was strongly opposed to British intervention. Britain had no formal treaty obligation to France. The Entente Cordiale was a political alignment, not a binding military alliance. There was a genuine possibility, in the final days of July, that Britain would stay out. What changed everything was Belgium. Germany's war plan, the Schlieffen Plan, required German forces to sweep through neutral Belgium in order to attack France from the north and west, bypassing the heavily fortified French-German border. Germany's invasion of Belgium on August 4, 1914, gave Britain's pro-intervention faction exactly the moral and legal justification they needed. Britain had guaranteed Belgian neutrality under the 1839 Treaty of London. Violation of that neutrality gave the interventionists an argument that the neutralists could not easily defeat. But here is the detail that the textbooks consistently underplay. British military and naval planners had been preparing for intervention on France's side for years before 1914. The Anglo-French military conversations, secret staff talks between British and French military officers, had been ongoing since 1906. Britain and France had coordinated naval arrangements. The British Expeditionary Force had been organized with precisely this kind of continental intervention in mind. The formal British commitment to France was deniable right up until August 1914. The practical preparation for that commitment had been underway for 8 years. Foreign Secretary Edward Grey, the man most responsible for British foreign policy in the July crisis, had been managing this duality with considerable skill, maintaining Britain's formal freedom of action while keeping the French reassured that Britain would stand by them if the moment came. Grey's biographers have debated for decades whether this represented wise statesmanship or deliberate deception. What is not debatable is that Grey was one of a small number of British officials who understood the full scope of the Anglo-French military relationship, and that the British cabinet as a whole was not fully informed of what its own military had been planning. When you assemble all of these pieces together, the blank check in Berlin, the preparatory mobilization in St. Petersburg, Moltke's unauthorized communication to Vienna, Grey's management of the Anglo-French military relationship, a picture emerges that is considerably more disturbing than the standard sleepwalker account. This was not a war that happened because the wrong man was driving through the wrong street in Sarajevo. This was a war that happened because a relatively small number of men, generals, foreign ministers, chancellors, chiefs of staff, made specific decisions at specific moments on the basis of specific calculations. Some of those calculations were reasonable, given what those men believed and what they feared. Some were reckless, some were self-serving, and some were made on the basis of military and strategic logic that had very little to do with what was actually good for the populations those men nominally served. The 65 million soldiers who would eventually be mobilized, the 20 million who would die in the conflict, the civilian populations who would suffer through blockades and famines and the collapse of the old European order. None of them were in those rooms when the decisions were made. They were just the ones who paid the price. Let's stop talking about chancelleries and general staffs for a moment. Let's talk about what actually happened to people. Because the decisions we examined, the blank check, the mobilization timetables, the secret military conversations, the ultimatums drafted to be rejected, Those decisions were made by men who would spend the war in offices, in headquarters, in government buildings. Men who would survive. Men who, in many cases, would go on to write their memoirs and shape how history remembered their choices. The people who paid for those choices were somewhere else entirely. They were in the trenches at Verdun, in the breadlines of Berlin, in the rubble of villages in northern France that ceased to exist as functioning communities for a generation, in the hospitals of London, where doctors encountered injuries so new that medical science had no established protocols for treating them, in the fields of Gallipoli, where young men from Australia and New Zealand died in a campaign conceived in London and executed with catastrophic incompetence. The scale of what happened between 1914 and 1918 is genuinely difficult for the human mind to absorb. So let's try to make it concrete, one dimension at a time. Military deaths in World War I, killed in combat, died of wounds, died of disease directly attributable to the war, are estimated by historians at somewhere between 17 and 20 million. France lost approximately 1.4 million military dead. In a country with a pre-war population of roughly 40 million, that means France lost approximately 1 in 28 of its entire population in uniform. Among French men aged 18 to 30 in 1914, the death rate was catastrophic. Historians estimate that roughly 27% of that specific demographic cohort did not survive the war. More than 1 in 4 young Frenchmen dead in 4 years. Germany's military losses were higher in absolute terms, approximately 2 million killed. Britain and its empire lost close to 1 million military dead, of whom roughly 700,000 came from the British Isles themselves. Russia's military losses are the hardest to calculate with precision, but the most widely accepted estimates suggest somewhere between 1.7 and 2 million killed in action or dead of wounds. Serbia, tiny, landlocked Serbia, the country whose relationship with Austria-Hungary was the immediate trigger for the conflict, lost approximately 45,000 military dead out of a pre-war population of roughly 4.5 million. Proportionally, Serbia suffered the highest military death rate of any combatant nation in the war. These are not statistics. These are individual human lives, each one the center of a family's world, each one representing decades of unlived experience. But military deaths, as enormous as they were, tell only part of the story. The war produced civilian suffering on a scale that the pre-war imagination had not prepared anyone for. In Belgium and northern France, German occupation beginning in August 1914 created conditions of systematic economic extraction. The German military administration requisitioned food, livestock, machinery, and raw materials on a massive scale. The Belgian Relief Commission, organized by the American diplomat and future President Herbert Hoover, estimated that by early 1915, the occupied territories faced genuine starvation without outside assistance. Hoover's commission eventually organized the shipment of roughly 5 million tons of food to Belgium and northern France over the course of the war, one of the largest humanitarian operations in history to that point. Germany itself faced the British naval blockade, which cut off imports of food and raw materials with increasing severity as the war progressed. By 1916 and 1917, German civilian food consumption had fallen dramatically from pre-war levels. The winter of 1916 to 1917 is known in German history as the turnip winter, because turnips replaced potatoes as the primary caloric source for much of the civilian population after the potato harvest failed. German civilian deaths attributable to wartime malnutrition and related causes have been estimated by historians at somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 people. These were not soldiers. These were elderly women, children, industrial workers, urban residents, people who had no part in the decisions that produced the blockade or the war itself. The Ottoman Empire was the site of the war's most concentrated civilian catastrophe. The Armenian genocide, carried out by the Ottoman government beginning in 1915, under cover of wartime conditions, resulted in the deaths of somewhere between 600,000 and 1.5 million Armenian civilians. What is not in serious dispute is that the wartime context provided both the pretext and the administrative mechanism for the systematic destruction of a civilian population. Now let's follow the money one more time, because the financial suffering of ordinary people during and after the war is one of the least told dimensions of the conflict's true cost. When the major European powers went to war in August 1914, they faced an immediate financial crisis. The gold standard was effectively suspended within weeks. Governments needed to finance military operations on a scale that gold reserves could not support. They turned to paper money, to borrowing, and to taxation. Britain borrowed massively from the United States. By the end of 1916, Britain and France together owed American creditors, most prominently the House of J.P. Morgan, which served as the official purchasing agent for the Allied governments in the United States, something in the region of $2 billion. J.P. Morgan and Company had organized a syndicated loan to Britain and France in September 1915, the largest foreign loan in Wall Street history to that point, totaling $500 million. The Morgan firm earned substantial commissions on this and subsequent transactions. The firm's financial interests were, by late 1915, deeply aligned with an Allied victory, a fact that shaped American banking opinion toward the Allied cause in ways that were never fully transparent to the American public. Germany, cut off from international capital markets by the Allied blockade, was forced to finance its war almost entirely internally. The German government issued war bonds in 9 successive rounds between 1914 and 1918. These bonds were marketed to ordinary German citizens with intense propaganda. They were sold as a patriotic duty, as a safe investment, as the financial foundation of German victory. By the end of the war, the German government had raised approximately 98 billion marks through war bonds. Millions of ordinary German families had invested their savings in these instruments. And when Germany lost the war, when the currency collapsed and the Weimar Republic inherited the fiscal wreckage of the imperial government, those bonds became essentially worthless. The German hyperinflation of 1921 to 1923 was the direct consequence of the German government's wartime financial decisions, compounded by the reparations burden imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. And its victims were precisely the people who had been most patriotic: the middle-class savers who had bought the war bonds, the pensioners on fixed incomes, the small business owners whose savings evaporated as the currency collapsed. By November 1923, the German mark had fallen to a rate of approximately 4 trillion marks to the dollar. A loaf of bread that had cost about 50 pfennigs before the war cost over 100 billion marks at the peak of the hyperinflation. Lifetime savings were wiped out in weeks. The psychological dimension of the war's cost is the hardest to quantify, and perhaps the most important. Before 1914, the dominant cultural attitude toward war in educated European circles was a combination of romantic idealization and blithe confidence in the ability of modern civilization to manage conflict rationally. The reality of industrial warfare, the machine guns and artillery barrages, the mustard gas and the barbed wire, the rats in the flooded trenches, the men who came home without faces or with minds destroyed by what the doctors of the time called shell shock, and we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, shattered that cultural assumption completely and permanently. The literature of disillusionment that emerged from the war, Wilfred Owen's poetry, Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, Siegfried Sassoon's memoirs, was not merely a literary movement. It was a cultural reckoning with a specific betrayal. The young men of Europe had been sent to die for reasons that, when examined honestly, had almost nothing to do with the ideals in whose name the war was fought. The war's end did not end the suffering. In many ways, it restructured it and sent it ricocheting forward through the following decades. The influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1919 killed somewhere between 50 and 100 million people worldwide. The conditions created by the war, massive movements of troops, overcrowded military camps, malnourished civilian populations with weakened immune systems, overwhelmed medical systems, were directly responsible for the pandemic's extraordinary lethality. The war did not cause the influenza virus, but the war created the conditions that turned a respiratory illness into the deadliest pandemic in recorded human history. And then there was the peace. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, imposed reparations on Germany totaling 132 billion gold marks, a figure that John Maynard Keynes, who attended the Paris Peace Conference as a British Treasury representative, denounced immediately and publicly as economically impossible and politically catastrophic. Keynes resigned his position and published The Economic Consequences of the Peace within months, arguing with extraordinary prescience that the reparations burden would destabilize Germany, create chronic economic grievances, and ultimately produce another war. He was right about all of it. The reparations burden, combined with the loss of German territory, the forced disarmament, and the clause assigning Germany sole moral responsibility for the war, the notorious war guilt clause, created in Germany a political environment of resentment, humiliation, and economic desperation that proved to be exactly the soil in which political extremism flourished. Adolf Hitler's rise was not the inevitable consequence of Versailles, but it was made dramatically more possible by it. The economic desperation of ordinary Germans in the early 1930s, the destruction of middle-class savings by hyperinflation and then by the Depression, the sense of national humiliation that Versailles had embedded in German political culture, these were the specific material conditions that made the Nazi movement's appeal comprehensible, if not excusable, to millions of people who in more stable circumstances might never have embraced it. The decisions made in the chancelleries and general staffs in July and August 1914 thus produced consequences that extended not just through 4 years of industrialized slaughter, but through a century of European and global history. The Second World War, the Holocaust, the Cold War, the redrawing of the map of the Middle East that still shapes the conflicts of today. All of these flow in traceable chains of cause and effect from those summer weeks in 1914 when a small number of men decided, for their various reasons, that war was preferable to the alternatives. The people who lived through those consequences had not been asked. They were never asked. Here is a question that sounds simple, but isn't. Why, more than 100 years after the end of World War I, do most people still believe the assassination version? Not just believe it casually, believe it deeply. Believe it in a way that makes the more complicated, more accurate, more disturbing story feel somehow revisionist, feel like a conspiracy theory rather than a serious historical argument. This is not an accident. The way we remember World War I, the version that gets taught in schools, that appears in documentaries, that structures the commemorations on November 11th, was not assembled neutrally by dispassionate scholars working their way through the evidence. It was shaped from the very beginning by institutions and individuals with very specific interests in how the story was told. Follow that process, and something important becomes clear. The myth of the war's origins did not survive by accident. It survived because it was useful. And the question of who found it useful tells you a great deal about how power shapes memory. Start with the most immediate layer: the governments that fought the war. Every major belligerent government in World War I faced the same fundamental problem once the scale of the catastrophe became clear. The war had cost millions of lives. It had consumed national wealth on an almost incomprehensible scale. It had produced suffering that the pre-war promises of quick victory and honorable sacrifice had in no way prepared populations for. Governments needed a narrative that justified those costs. And the assassination narrative, the story of an unprovoked act of violence that set off a chain of events no one could control, was extraordinarily well suited to that purpose. If the war was nobody's fault in particular, if it was an almost geological event, a shifting of tectonic plates that no individual or institution could have stopped, then no government bore primary responsibility for its consequences. The bereaved families, the maimed veterans, the ruined economies, these were the tragic but unavoidable costs of a war that had been forced on civilization by the logic of events, rather than by the decisions of specific men. The British government was particularly active in managing historical memory from an early stage. Even before the war ended, the British Foreign Office began organizing the official documentary record with an eye toward posterity. The 11-volume collection of British documents on the origins of the war, published between 1926 and 1938, was compiled with the explicit intention of demonstrating that Britain had been a reluctant participant, dragged into conflict by German aggression and the violation of Belgian neutrality. The German government, for its part, spent the Weimar period trying to demonstrate the opposite, that the war guilt clause of Versailles was historically unjustified, and that responsibility for the war was shared among all the major powers. The German Foreign Office published its own multi-volume documentary collection and funded academic research designed to distribute blame as widely as possible. Both governments were doing the same thing, using historical scholarship as a tool of political argument. The academic discipline of history itself is not immune to these pressures. The first generation of serious academic historians who wrote about the war's origins were, in many cases, nationals of the countries they were writing about. They had personal connections to the events they described. Some had served in the war. Some had family members who had died in it. Their access to archival sources depended, in many cases, on the cooperation of the governments whose decisions they were examining. This created structural incentives towards certain kinds of conclusions and away from others. The historian who concluded that his own government bore primary responsibility for the war faced professional obstacles that the historian who reached more comfortable conclusions did not. Access to archives could be restricted, official cooperation could be withdrawn, funding sources could dry up. The most influential single work on the war's origins, published in the 20th century, is probably Fritz Fischer's Germany's Aims in the First World War, published in 1961. Fischer, a German historian, argued on the basis of extensive archival research that Germany had pursued deliberately aggressive aims in July 1914 and bore primary responsibility for the war's outbreak. The reaction to Fischer's book in West Germany was extraordinary in its intensity. Fischer was accused of being anti-German, of serving Soviet propaganda interests, of undermining the Federal Republic's international relationships. Senior German historians organized formal attacks on his methodology. The West German government refused to fund a planned lecture tour of the United States by Fischer, an intervention in academic affairs that would be scandalous by contemporary standards. Fischer ultimately prevailed in the sense that his core argument became widely accepted in the international historical community. But the ferocity of the reaction to his work illustrates something important. Even 60 years after the war, the question of who bore responsibility for it was not a purely academic question. It had live political consequences that made governments, institutions, and established scholarly communities deeply uncomfortable with conclusions they did not like. The textbook problem deserves its own examination because it is where historical mythology has its most durable influence. Walk into virtually any high school in the English-speaking world and find the chapter on World War I. What you will almost certainly find is a version of the war's origins, organized around 4 concepts, usually presented with a memorable acronym: Main, militarism, alliances, imperialism, nationalism. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand appears as the spark that ignited these pre-existing tensions. This framework is not wrong exactly, but the main framework does something very specific by how it organizes the story. It distributes agency so broadly that no particular government, institution, or decision-maker bears meaningful responsibility. Militarism was a Europe-wide phenomenon. Alliances involved multiple parties. Imperialism was practiced by all the major powers. Nationalism was a force that affected populations, not just elites. By framing the war's causes in terms of these structural forces, the textbook narrative effectively removes human decision-making from the center of the story. The blank check disappears. Moltke's unauthorized communication to Vienna disappears. Gray's management of the secret Anglo-French military conversations disappears. Bethmann Hollweg's private calculation that a European war was preferable to continued German decline disappears. What's left is a story about impersonal historical forces producing inevitable outcomes, a story that, by design or by accident, protects the reputations of the specific men who made the specific decisions. The main framework became dominant in English-language history education during the 1920s and 1930s, precisely the period when the diplomatic controversies over war guilt and Versailles reparations were most politically sensitive. It has proven remarkably durable in educational curricula despite decades of more sophisticated academic scholarship. There is a deeper layer to this story that requires us to look at the role of specific institutions. The British Foreign Office's management of its own documentary record is a case study in how bureaucratic self-protection shapes historical narrative. The Anglo-French military conversations, the secret staff talks that had been ongoing since 1906, were known to only a handful of British officials during the pre-war period. The cabinet as a whole was not informed of their full scope. Grey had repeatedly deflected questions about the nature of Britain's commitment to France, maintaining the fiction of British freedom of action while the military was planning for intervention. When these conversations became public knowledge after the war, they posed an obvious problem for the narrative that Britain had entered the war purely in response to German aggression and Belgian neutrality. If Britain had been planning for continental intervention for 8 years, the war's entry looked less like a principled response to German aggression and more like the activation of a pre-existing commitment that the public had never been informed about. The official handling of this problem was not to suppress the documents. It was to frame them in ways that minimized their significance. The conversations were described as non-binding, as exploratory, as creating no formal commitments, which was technically true in a narrow legal sense, but which rather missed the point that 8 years of joint military planning had created a practical commitment that was effectively irreversible by July 1914, regardless of what the legal formalities said. This kind of careful framing, technically accurate, substantively misleading, is the mechanism through which institutional historical narratives are constructed. The major endowments that established chairs in international relations at British and American universities in the 1920s, the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the foundations associated with major American banking and industrial families, had their own views about how the war's origins should be understood, and their own interest in conclusions that emphasized systemic factors over individual or institutional responsibility. The Carnegie Endowment funded an elaborate program of documentary publication on the war's origins in the 1920s. The program produced genuinely valuable scholarship. It also produced scholarship that was broadly shaped by the endowment's institutional preference for narratives emphasizing shared responsibility and the failures of the international system rather than the culpability of specific governments. This is not a conspiracy. It is something more mundane and therefore more pervasive. The ordinary operation of institutional incentives in shaping what questions get funded, what conclusions get published, and what frameworks become dominant. There is one more dimension to why the myth persists, and it is perhaps the most uncomfortable to articulate. The accurate story of World War I's origins, the story of specific men making specific decisions on the basis of financial pressures, military timetables, and strategic calculations, is a story that implicates institutions that still exist. The Bank of England still exists. The French banking system still exists. The tradition of secret diplomatic commitments, of governments making military arrangements that their own populations are not informed about, still very much exists. The relationship between armaments industries and military establishments still very much exists. The main framework, by contrast, locates the causes of the war in conditions that no longer exist in their pre-1914 form. By attributing the war to these vanished historical structures, the conventional narrative implicitly argues that the conditions that produced the war have been left behind, that we have learned the lessons and built different institutions. The more accurate narrative raises a more disturbing possibility, that the underlying mechanisms are not historical relics. They are present conditions. Let's be direct about something. Everything we've covered in this series, the financial entanglements, the secret military commitments, the arms industry's relationship with government, the preventive war logic, the gap between what leaders tell their populations and what they actually decide in private, none of it is ancient history. Every single mechanism we've examined in the origins of World War I is operational today, not metaphorically, not as a loose analogy. Structurally, institutionally, operationally, the machine is still running. It has new labels on it. But if you know what you're looking at, the shape is unmistakable. Start with the financial entanglement of military alliances. Before 1914, French banks channeled billions of francs into Russian government bonds, with the explicit strategic purpose of financing Russian military infrastructure aimed at Germany. The lending was dressed up as commercial investment. Its strategic function was an open secret among the people who mattered and invisible to the millions of ordinary French savers who bought the bonds. Now look at the present. The United States currently holds approximately $850 billion worth of outstanding foreign military financing and security assistance commitments across more than 100 countries. The defense contractors who produce the weapons and systems transferred through these programs, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, Boeing Defense, are publicly traded companies whose shareholders include the largest asset managers in the world: BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street. When a foreign policy crisis develops in a region where American security commitments are active, the financial interests of these institutions are directly at stake, not abstractly, specifically. A decision to activate security commitments means contracts, replenishment orders, production line extensions, congressional appropriations. Lockheed Martin's revenues in 2023 exceeded $67 billion, the highest in the company's history, driven in significant part by increased demand following the outbreak of the war in Ukraine. Raytheon, which produces the Patriot missile systems and the Stinger anti-aircraft missiles that became central to that conflict, reported similar dynamics. This is not evidence of conspiracy, it is evidence of structural incentive alignment. Exactly the same structural incentive alignment that connected Krupp's profits to German military expansion in 1914. The form is different. The underlying logic is identical. The secret military commitment problem, the gap between what democratic governments tell their publics and what they actually plan and commit to in private, is not a relic of Edwardian diplomacy. In 2023, reporting by several major news organizations revealed that the United States had been providing Ukraine with intelligence support, satellite imagery, and operational planning assistance at a level that went significantly beyond what had been publicly acknowledged. The practical military commitment exceeded what the formal public position described. This is not a partisan point. The dynamic predates any current administration and will outlast it. It is a structural feature of how major powers manage security commitments, maintaining public deniability about the depth of involvement while allowing the practical commitment to deepen through bureaucratic and operational channels. Bethmann Hollweg would have recognized the mechanism immediately. The preventive war logic, the calculation that a declining power should consider fighting sooner rather than later while conditions are still relatively favorable, is perhaps the most dangerous of the mechanisms we have examined. And it is very much present in contemporary strategic debate. The academic and policy literature on what is sometimes called the Thucydides trap, the historical tendency for conflicts to arise when a rising power challenges an established one, has grown enormously over the past decade. Harvard political scientist Graham Allison examined 16 historical cases of rising power challenging established power and found that 12 of the 16 ended in war. The specific case that dominates contemporary strategic discussion is the relationship between the United States and China. American military and strategic planning documents from recent years have been explicit about the trajectory. The 2022 National Defense Strategy describes China as the United States pacing challenge and outlines a competitive framework that has very specific resource implications. Increased shipbuilding, new basing agreements in the Pacific, strengthened alliance commitments to Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Australia. Chinese military spending has grown substantially over the past 2 decades. Chinese naval construction has been extraordinary. China has launched more naval tonnage in the past 5 years than most navies possess in total. And here is where the 1914 parallel becomes most pointed. Some voices within the American strategic community, a minority but a serious one, have articulated versions of the preventive war argument. The logic runs: China's military capabilities are growing faster than American relative advantages can be sustained. There is a window, perhaps a decade, perhaps less, during which American military superiority in the Pacific is still sufficient to deter or defeat Chinese action regarding Taiwan. After that window closes, deterrence becomes more costly and less reliable. This is structurally identical to Moltke's 1914 argument. The names have changed, the geography has changed, the weapons systems have changed. The logic is the same. The United States defense budget for fiscal year 2024 was approximately $860 billion, larger, in real terms, than at any point during the Cold War, with the exception of the peak years of the Korean and Vietnam conflicts. The five largest American defense contractors, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon Technologies, Boeing Defense, General Dynamics, and Northrop Grumman, together spent approximately $60 million on federal lobbying in 2023. They collectively employed hundreds of former senior military officers and government officials through the revolving door. Their political action committees contributed to congressional campaigns across both parties. This is legal. It is disclosed. It is the normal operation of institutional interests in a democratic political system. And that normality, the fact that the structural entanglement of financial interests and military policy is so thoroughly institutionalized that it no longer seems remarkable, is precisely what makes it so powerful and so difficult to see clearly. Before 1914, the major European powers were financing their military buildups through a combination of taxation, domestic borrowing, and foreign lending that was creating genuine fiscal strain. The financial system was under pressure from the weight of the arms race even before the war began. Today, the United States is running federal deficits that, in the period since 2020, have reached levels unprecedented in peacetime. The national debt has exceeded $33 trillion. Defense spending is a substantial component of federal expenditure, and it has been politically insulated from the deficit reduction pressures that have affected other categories of spending. China holds somewhere in the region of $800 billion in U.S. Treasury securities. The financial interdependence of geopolitical rivals, the situation that Norman Angell argued in 1910 made major war irrational, is very much present in the contemporary world. And as Angell's argument failed to prevent 1914, the existence of financial interdependence today is not a guarantee against catastrophic miscalculation. So what is the actual lesson? The lesson is not that war is inevitable. The lesson is precisely the opposite. The lesson is that war in 1914 was not inevitable. It was produced by specific decisions made by specific people operating under specific pressures and incentives. Those decisions could, at multiple points, have been different. The blank check did not have to be issued. The Russian preparatory mobilization did not have to begin when it did. Grey could have made Britain's position explicit earlier, either deterring German action or allowing the Continental powers to find a negotiated solution. The machinery of the July crisis had many points at which human agency could have intervened. It did not intervene, not because intervention was impossible, but because the people with the power to intervene were operating within institutional, financial, and cognitive frameworks that made intervention feel more costly than escalation. That is the real structural insight of 1914. Not that great powers inevitably clash, but that the institutions, financial arrangements, and cognitive frameworks within which decision-makers operate can narrow the space of choices available to them until options that would be obviously preferable from the perspective of the populations affected become functionally invisible to the people making the decisions. And that narrowing of choice, that process by which the machine acquires its own logic and decision-makers become, in a real sense, its operators rather than its controllers, is precisely what we should be watching for today. Watching for it requires understanding not just the official story, the story that governments and institutions and textbooks offer, the story that protects reputations and distributes responsibility so widely that no one bears it meaningfully, but the structural story underneath, the financial flows, the institutional incentives, the gap between public commitments and private planning, the logic of the people in the rooms where decisions are actually made. It requires, in the simplest terms, following the money. Because the money, in 1914 and today, tells a story that the official narrative is specifically designed to obscure. After everything we've covered, the blank check, the financial entanglements, the secret military commitments, the preventive war logic, do you think the leaders of 1914 were genuinely trapped by forces beyond their control, or did they make choices they could have made differently? Type trapped or chose, because your answer to that question determines how seriously you take the parallels to today. Send this video to one person who still thinks World War I started because of an assassination. Not to argue with them, but because the real story of how that war began is the clearest lens we have for understanding how the world actually works right now in the headlines you're reading today. And next week, we're going inside a document that almost no one has read. An internal memorandum from the British Foreign Office, dated July 1914, that shows exactly what Grey and his senior advisors believed would happen if Germany moved against France. They knew, they calculated, and the memo reveals a calculation that the official history has spent a century papering over. That's next week. If you're not subscribed yet, now is the time, because this is the kind of history that changes how you see everything else.